Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part two of my interview with Dr. Roger Hendrix. For those of you who joined us for part one, you'll know that Roger grew up in the 50s and early 60s as a Southern California surfer Mormon guy. Served a mission for the church, had a firm testimony because of a experience at Institute, and served as his own leader on his mission, and but also maybe had a non-traditional teenage upbringing and young adult in the church before he was simultaneously became a really devout Mormon, but also a more casual, relaxed Mormon. And for him, it was less about the doctrine per se and more about the progression and the way that he felt like the church made him better. And it's been a fascinating interview so far, and it's only going to get more fascinating, I think. So now that you've come home from your mission, you've married Sherry in the temple. Was it the LA temple where you were married?
Los Angeles temple.
Okay. Let's talk about how you go from being married in the temple to working for CES. What's that path like? What was it? Were you from college planning on church education? And what was the reputation of people who worked in CES? What was the reputation of CES at the time? And what got you into it?
My stake president, who was my seminary teacher, turned around to have a daughter whom I taught in early morning seminary. And then he got back to me via her experience in my seminary class and said that Roger should be a full-time seminary teacher. And then my institute teacher that I was so close to and in his class had that spiritual experience, he recommended me to be a full-time seminary teacher. And so they contacted me, and then I said, hey, why not? Now, was it exciting during that time to be in the church education system? Well, remember, this was the sexual revolution, civil rights revolution, Vietnam War, and conservative leaders in the Mormon church and liberal leaders in the Mormon church, and being in religion, working with especially college kids who are in the throes of being a part of this was terribly enticing to me. And so I talked it over with Sherry, and she said, let's go for it. And we went for it, and I got assigned to teach full-time seminary in Magna, Utah, which most of the people in Magna worked in Kennecott copper mines, and so they were. It was a tough people, and I taught 2 years in seminary there.
What college would you have graduated from? What university?
Cal State Long Beach.
Okay, all right.
And I graduated on a Friday and started teaching in Magna, Utah on a Monday.
Okay.
And we slept in a park in Las Vegas that night because we didn't have enough money to go to a hotel, and our car wasn't big enough for us to sleep. So we slept in a park, ran out of gas, but still made it to the assignment on Monday.
All right. So what year would you have started teaching CES?
Around 1968.
Okay. So the Beatles are still going. Bobby Kennedy would have, MLK would have been assassinated by this point. Vietnam was starting to really pick up. Okay, so I get a sense for the time period. David O. McKay was still prophet,
right,
at that point, but he was aging.
Waning days. And
this would have been when Hubie Brown would have tried to get blacks the priesthood.
That's right.
When McKay was disabled, and this would have been when Harold B. Lee stepped on that, and so it's right before kind of Harold B. Lee and then Joseph Fielding Smith kind of take over the church. So, all right, I get a sense for that time period. Also, to what extent, who were your heroes amongst the Mormon general authorities at that early time, who would have been the early influences? I'm thinking in my mind, of course, Paul Dunn, maybe Sterling W. Sill. I'm also thinking about Lowell Benyon and Leonard Arrington would have been sort of coming up at that point. Dialogue, Journal would have been sort of coming up. So I'm wondering what Mormon leadership influences and what intellectual Mormon influences may or may not have been influencing you at that time.
Well, first of all, David O. McKay, even when he was bedridden, and then definitely Hubie Brown, his first counselor. I liked in Eldon Tanner. He was a great businessman, and he looked it. And he looked sharp. Once again, my emphasis on appearances. I loved the way he combed his hair. But Hubie Brown was my guy. And then next to Hubie Brown...
He was a Democrat, right?
He was a
Like
Democrat.
back then, a Mormon could be not only for civil rights, but could be a Democrat, and it wasn't a problem.
That's right. That's right. But the pressure was coming. That's when Elder Benson was saying... he doesn't know how a person could be a Democrat and a good Latter-day Saint.
How did Brown like that, I wonder?
Well, he didn't like it. And as a matter of fact, a lot of those guys, even conservative ones, didn't like the aggressiveness of Brother Benson with the John Birch Society and his very conservative political views. Harold B. Lee.
He was exiled to Europe for a while because they were so annoyed with the crazy things he was saying, right?
Yeah. Now, when you're in CES, you hear all of the underground talk, and so supposedly Joseph Fielding Smith said that Brother Benson had to go to Europe, to get a little humbling. And so you hear that. Whether he said that or not, I don't know. But nevertheless, he was shipped off to Europe. And
would you have heard about Bruce R. McConkey's first edition, the stuff that Greg Prince wrote about in David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism, that David O. McKay and others didn't like the first edition of Mormon Doctrine, that they told him not to publish a new edition, and then he did publish other editions once McKay was ailing, but that he had to make a bunch of changes. Would you have known about that at the time?
Yeah. The underground communication network was that that Mormon Doctrine was a very controversial book, and that David O. McKay, not only David O. McKay, but the First Presidency and certain members of the 12 weren't happy with it. But it continued on, and so it must have been accepted enough for him to continue on. Although we knew that he had been disciplined by the brethren, he had been called in and took his thrashing like a man, and so I wasn't a Bruce R. McConkey fan. I wasn't an Ezra Taft Benson fan. I was a Hubie Brown fan. I was a David O. McKay fan, and I was a Paul Dunn fan. And I was really a Paul Dunn fan.
So talk about that.
Paul Dunn was a full-time seminary teacher when I was growing up in Southern California, and he was an extremely popular speaker. Now, at that time, there's no criticism of him and the stories he told, and they were healthy stories. And so I kind of grew up admiring him. I met him. He was a close friend of the Institute instructor and director who was working with me as I was coming into the church, and Paul Dunn would come in to interview my institute director, and I would talk with him. He was always casual. His habit was he would lean up against the wall and cross one leg over the other. You know how easy to talk to, easy to laugh with, And he enjoyed a good story as well as telling a good story. So I grew up liking him. He drove a little VW Bug. I remember that. The CES guys all drove Volkswagens. And so in answer to your question in the previous section, CES guys had a good reputation, and it was still relatively new. That's when all the baby boomers were starting to go into college, and so the Institute program was flourishing. The programs associated with the Institute were flourishing. I loved that. I loved that as much as I loved anything. I thought it was, for example, the Latter-day Saints Student Association, its motto was meet needs. Now, that's right up my alley, because I thought the church was meeting my needs. And here we go, the official church organization, the Latter-day Saints Student Association. If there's just one person who likes a particular activity, hold the activity for that one person, meet their needs, find out their needs. And my buddies now that I associate with, who are up in Berkeley and Stanford, they had the same experience that I had down south in my college experience. And the guy at the center of that was Paul Dunn. And so he was to us a giant among grass. And so,
what was he like? You mentioned a little bit about he could be moody sometimes. Can you talk about kind of that and any other personality traits that are worth mentioning?
As the years went on and he had heart problems, and when I was the director of the Institute of Religion at the University of Southern California, now we're fast forwarding, and we had built a new institute building. And he came to, we invited him to come and dedicate the building, speak to the students on the University of Southern California campus. And he wasn't the same. He seemed a little tired, not necessarily grouchy, but if you said something that he didn't like, he could let you know he didn't like it. So he wasn't like he was. And so I'm only assuming that because of his heart problems, and probably because he's starting to get criticism about this time, that he was sensitive.
Got it.
And so I noticed it. I took it into consideration. I still dug the guy. Now, remember, he had been the institute director at the University of Southern California 20 years previous to me. And then John Whitsoe had been the institute instructor or director as an apostle 20 years before Paul Dunn. And so I felt like I was in a privileged seat. Once again, hey, I'm progressing. I'm with these major league guys. I took it seriously. I loved every minute of it. And that he was grouchy one day, that had never mind with me.
In those early years, late 60s, early 70s, would you have had any idea that maybe some of the stories he was telling in General Conference or on these tours or in these books were made up, were falsified? Or did you just love the stories and want to believe they were true about his war, epic tales of saving people in war and playing on a Major League Baseball team and all that? Those were parts of his stories as I remember. Would you have had any idea he was telling tall tales?
No, I really didn't. I have a tendency that when I buy into a person, I trust them. And so I'll go along with them. And usually it's someone else who starts digging up stuff. And one of my buddies, who was an institute director at Cal State Long Beach when I was the institute director at USC, started questioning Brother Dunn on his war stories. And the institute guys that we I'd chum around with. We would come together in faculty meetings and that. They were starting to question those things and maybe make jokes about them. But still at that time, that didn't bother me. But at least I started hearing about it. And because, I was modeling a little bit after him, as I had followed him as an institute director, true, 20 years later, I was into it.
My understanding is that correlation was kind of introduced in the 60s and really started picking up in the 70s from Harold B. Lee onward. And I know what my CES education experience was by the time, the 80s rolls around, which was just very Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie type curriculum. What would your curriculum have been? And if you were sort of a non-Bruce R. McConkie, non-doctrinal Mormon, but instead a Mormon around progress, what would the curriculum have been like in the late 60s, early to mid 70s? And what would a teaching experience with you had been like? Would it have been about signs of the times and 6,000 year Earth and no global flood, or would it have been a totally different curriculum experience with you as teacher?
Yeah. Well, when I was in Southern California in the Institute program with college students, because I'd had such a good experience as a student myself, I wanted my students to have the same experience I had. And it wasn't necessarily with a very conservative doctrinal approach that was coming down the line that I hadn't felt yet. For me, it was becoming involved in running for student body office on the college campus. It was being involved in the community. It was building a building. It was, there were two types of guys in CES at that time. There were the scholars, like Alan Parrish and Richard Holtzoffel, and then there were kind of the guys like me who liked building programs up, who liked getting as many kids in those institute classes, getting them involved in ways that I thought would help them in their future lives. And so at that point, this tightening, I guess, this correlated curriculum wasn't hitting me yet. But by the late 70s and early 80s, things started to change. There were institute personnel who were asked to leave the institute program because they had their own curriculum. Good as that may have been, but there was this emphasis: we want you to teach the curriculum we produce, not that you produce as a scholar, not that you produce even as a conservative doctrinaire. And these guys didn't like doing that, so they were asked to leave the program. And so I began to notice that, and also noticed that a couple of the really intellectual types were actually leaving the church at that time. As a matter of fact, my predecessor by 10 years at USC left the church. And so
Did you ask him why? Did you find out why?
Well, he said it was intellectual reasons. It could have been extramarital activity, and so those were the two reasons that usually took place, and so even the idea of a CES guy being hauled in for a court trial, or anybody being hauled in for that matter, started picking up. And by that time, I had been on a couple of high councils and went through high council courts, and they were more frequent. And so, you would have to have your head in the sand to not at least ask the question, are things changing? They were changing, but they weren't changing so much for me because of my orientation of I wanted these kids to change the world type of thing. And the curriculum was a means, not an end, to motivate the kids. I would always say in my institute classes, give me 2 or 3 really exciting kids and we'll change the world. And the kids loved that stuff. And I would say, you guys have a great future. Go out and change. Don't just read history, make history. That was my big thing. I love that statement, and felt that I was kind of that guy. Loved building buildings, building up enrollment. Always wanted to be honest about it, and part of that came as that confidence that I had from the mission and that very good experience I had as a student, as an undergraduate.
How many years did you end up serving in CES total? Kind of from what year to what year?
15 years. I think it was 1968, and I was part-time by 1983. And
okay. That really matches the Leonard Arrington era. I think Arrington ascended around 72 and ended around 82. Would you have known anything about either Lowell Bennion or Leonard Arrington during those years?
Yeah, they called it, they had a special name for Leonard Arrington and his group. And then
Church History Department, right? Or
no,
Camelot?
Camelot.
Okay, the Camelot years.
Yeah, and that's what it was called. And all kinds of stuff was coming out.
You were hearing about it as a CES
well,
guy.
And we were starting to get articles about it and discuss it in our faculty meetings. And so, on the one hand, there was correlation creeping into the organization of the church. And on the other hand, there was this period of Camelot of the church vaults being opened up. And it was an exciting period. I loved dialogue. Even the graphics and the covers of it and the articles, talk so openly. And my buddy in CES was Gordon Moss, and his brother was Armin Moss. And Armin Moss was one of the really heavyweight contributing authors. And so I got to know Armin. And then that's when I started asking, piqued my interest, because the correlation, the Leonard Arrington, the dialogue, they were all kind of colliding. And so I started asking a lot of questions. Now, apart from that, my leaving CES, I don't think had anything to do with this tightening up. I just knew that things were changing. It was that I started getting into administration, and full-time administration in being the administrator over half of Southern California for a year, and then the teaching support consultant for 2 years after that. And I just sincerely didn't like it. Not there's anything wrong with it, but kind of the vigor of the revolution and the college experience of, battling civil rights and talking to students about, will the blacks ever get the priesthood? You're banging up against that every single day and talking. One of my favorite students was a guy by the name of Frederick Geddix, who is now a professor of constitutional law at BYU, came in and asked me about the black question. And at that time, I was kind of warming up intellectually, and I said, well, I'll tell you what my mother told me. You don't have to believe anything that's not true. And so, and he said, you don't have to believe that this is doctrine or not even policy. No. Yeah. Well, where'd you get that? I said, from my mom. You don't have to believe anything that's not true. Now, I believe that. I think that's cool. And I think guys like Hubie Brown and Paul Dunn, oh gosh, and and Duff Hanks, and who were some of the, and that's when Jeff Holland was coming up, and so there was this very moderate, modern, progressive movement still in the church that I liked, but I didn't like being an administrator. I didn't feel the excitement that I did when I was in the everyday working with students in campus life. So I had a chance in a million. A guy in my stake, and by this time I'm in the stake presidency, and we asked this guy to be on our high council. He happened to be the general manager of KBIG Radio and Coit Radio up in San Francisco and KBIG in Los Angeles. And so he said, do you have any interest in starting a sideband radio institute program? And then I ended, yeah. At USC we had we went from an enrollment of 137 to 1,100.
Whoa.
Yeah. I challenge any CES guy, to match that.
So that was you growing the institute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
a builder.
A builder, a lover, and so. What were we talking about?
You were going to talk about leaving CES, but let me ask you a question before you do that. Is that okay?
Right. Yeah.
And I'll take you right to that. Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, which was written by David O. McKay's niece, would have come out in 1945. And then the Tanners, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, would have started their work in the 60s, and it would have really started picking up steam in the 70s. And then you would have had some of this Leonard Arrington stuff coming out. I'm curious, first of all, what would your impression have been of No Man Knows My History during the 60s and 70s? Would you have even heard of the book? Would you have read it? And what would you have thought about it?
It was the seminal piece of historical work that the Institute guys believed in, that they would share with one another. Not that some would go public with it in their institute classes, others wouldn't. And so I read that thing cover to cover. It had the feel of truth. And so I booked that. That's...
She was an apostate.
Yeah.
So why are LDS, CES instructors, institute leaders reading that book in the 60s and 70s and not denouncing it as anti-Mormon, hate speech and avoiding it?
Well, some did,
Right.
But remember, that was a time when there was this creative tension, the tension between Hubie Brown and Ezra Taft Benson. That tension was going on. So we were kind of used to that. We were used to the tension. We were used to the Dialogue magazine. And so when Fawn Brody's book came out and guys like myself started reading it, it was well researched, and it had the feel of truth. And so you just, you can accept something and still be in the church. And I accepted it, and I was in the church.
So this is actually something I didn't expect, and it's kind of blown my mind a little bit. Because as a devout Mormon growing up in the 80s, I would not have known that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I would not have known about polyandry. I would have not have known about the child brides. I would not have known about the peepstone and the hat. I would not have known about the Book of Abraham problems, the Kirtland Bank scandal, Mountain Meadows Massacre. I wouldn't have known about any of that. And it sounds like you and many other CES and Institute, instructors would have known about all that in the 60s and 70s.
Especially in the 70s.
And how in the world how did that not reach me by the time I'm in the 80s? If that was in the church education system, why wasn't it in the general church awareness, all that stuff? Did you just never talk about it to your students?
Well, during the 70s, students would come in and you would talk to them, and there wasn't this press for them to be obedient, to hear and to obey. The philosophy of the church education system, especially at the institute level, especially in Southern California, was these kids have got to arrive at their testimony on their own, and you're helping them, and you want them to ask questions. So you're constantly talking with kids, not only in the classroom, but in your office. They're asking those questions. You're giving them your best thoughts on it. And my best thoughts would tend to be more progressive and liberal. And no, I didn't believe that the blacks being withheld from the priesthood. I didn't believe it was doctrine. I didn't believe it was good policy. And so I just didn't believe it. And just went my merry way. And when I was asked, that's what I would say. Now,
And that didn't get you in trouble.
no.
Interesting.
Now, some guys it got into trouble, but it didn't get Grant Palmer into trouble.
But it did get Leonard Arrington into trouble, and it did get Lowell Bennion into trouble. That kind of stuff, did affect some of the people in Salt Lake. So maybe part of that's the California distance from church headquarters, maybe?
I think part of that is, and I think you would have to take Lowell Bennion's situation and look at that and separate that out from Leonard Arrington's situation. And I'm willing to do that because goodness knows we were talking about it. But as far as my situation was concerned, I wasn't Lowell Bennion, I wasn't George T. Boyd, I wasn't any of these guys, and I was charting my own course, and I felt good about it. And then I wanted to leave because I had the opportunity to go out into the world, and I did that.
Really quick, so how would you have personally reconciled and answered questions about Joseph Smith's polygamy and the polyandry? How would you have reconciled that and answered questions about that in the 70s?
We didn't know about the polyandry.
Well, wasn't that in Fawn Brody's book or not?
Don't know.
Okay.
Don't remember it.
So it didn't. If it was in Brody's book, it wouldn't have stuck out to you.
No, the polygamy did.
Okay.
Well, goodness knows in our faculty in-service lessons, we had enough lessons on polygamy and who was the first one to really live polygamy. And people were on fire with coming out with this new research and these new findings in the 70s. And like Andrew Ehot was just kind of a champion of champions. He got into trouble. And there's a guy by the name of John Childs who was in the CES program, and he wrote a manual about Mormon polygamy, it was called. And he said that Oliver Cowdery was the first one to practice polygamy, and that was the tension between him and Joseph Smith, and that was going on as early as 1831, 1832, and Joseph Smith called Oliver Cowdery to repentance, and then these guys were giving a date by date blow of how polygamy progressed. And so we got that information. I knew that Joseph Smith had lived polygamy, but did it bother me? No.
How?
That he lived polygamy?
Yeah.
I always felt that sometimes we got history and doctrine mixed up. And I always felt that polygamy was a practice and that we did it, it was done away with, and
Time to move on.
I look at the modern church. Look at all these activities. My sons are becoming Eagle Scouts, and these arcane subjects about polygamy, that's in the past, and as long as it doesn't touch me and my family, I'm not gonna take it on. I'm interested in the modern church, my kids, my progress, and building up my institute programs.
What about Book of Mormon historicity? So B.H. Roberts would have been worried about that, I guess, in the 30s and 40s, right? So, there was certainly awareness of problems with the Book of Mormon in terms of it really being a historical document, anachronisms, all that stuff, even back then. Would that have ever come to your consciousness, sort of questions about, did this history in this book ever really happen?
For me personally, yeah. I kind of just dropped talking about the historicity of the Book of Mormon. It didn't jive with my common sense. They weren't digging anything out of the ground that remotely correlated with what the Book of Mormon was purporting. So I was starting to move in the direction of these are important stories, moral stories. And so I just got in there, started teaching about, look at Nephi's faith, and tried to get through all the wars, and kind of just let my foot off the gas pedal on the historicity. It seemed that there was a gap there, and I knew it.
But would you have ever had some sort of big faith crisis about that? Is this book really what it claims to be? And am I comfortable teaching people about it if it's not what it claims to be? Or did you kind of put it on a shelf and ignore it because of the good of the church and the culture and the social benefits?
Yeah, I wasn't a guy. I've heard this recent stuff where we put it on a shelf and it gets so full it breaks. I didn't usually put anything on the shelf. I just kind of took my position, moved forward with it, and I just didn't think this thing was a historical document, and then made my decisions accordingly.
But that didn't make you think Joseph was a fraud and throw the whole church out if the Book of Mormon's made up?
Well, Joseph Smith, to even the believers, has always been a controversial figure. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I can go along with everything in this church except the Joseph Smith story. And so they go along with everything except the Joseph Smith story. For me, I thought that Joseph Smith was a remote figure to me. He was a figure in history. He started the church. The issue of the gold plates, how he translated that. Did it baffle me? I always had this feeling it was kind of a story, and look at what it's produced. Look at our steakhouse. Look at sacrament meeting. Look at the road shows. Look at BYU, and that was when BYU football teams started coming into national prominence. I said, "This certainly by your fruit you shall know them, and this is good fruit." Remember Gary Chidey, the first well-known Mormon quarterback who pretended he was Joe Namath, fell in love with that guy, and BYU pass ball. It just took everybody by surprise. So I was living in fat heaven. But it's not that we didn't discuss it. You discuss it, you know it, and you make positions. Okay, this is what happened. Let's go.
What about Book of Abraham? By the 60s, the papyrus would have been discovered, and Egyptologists would have started saying that there's no relationship between the papyrus and the Book of Abraham. Would that have come to your attention during the 70s?
Yeah.
Same thing?
That's when I started saying, you can't really beat history. We find the papyrus, and we know what the Egyptologists are, how they're translating it. We know how Joseph Smith translated it. So it must not have come from those sheets. Well, where did it come from? Now, this was starting to be the birth of starting to reconcile myself with, who is this character, Joseph Smith? I mean, if he translated these books, or did he just make the stories up? Did it just flow out of his head? And so for me, it was more, who is this guy? How did he do these things? And look at all the thousands of people who bought into it. From the East Coast to the West Coast, thousands of people migrated across the whole of the United States following this guy. And they're not all dumb, and certainly my grandparents and great-grandparents, they weren't dumb. They came from Denmark, and so it was more, what is he? I started asking the question of who is he? What is he about? What is this thing about? Because the Book of Abraham stuff, you can't hardly beat that, can you? I mean, the history doesn't match up. So you start asking the question, and any thoughtful person would go for an alternative narrative. I did.
Right. Okay. Can you tell us about any interactions with general authorities during your time in CES, including Jeff Holland? Any stories, general authority stories, Boyd K. Packer stories, any interactions with general authorities that are stories worth telling during your CES years?
Yeah, I told you about Marion G. Romney.
Right.
I thought he ended up pretty good guy. I mean, he signed my paper so I could get into CES, and I told him I wasn't racist or a bigot. He told me he wasn't, and his fellow apostles weren't. So there's kind of a quid pro quo there. The next big one I met was Boyd Packer, and that's my first year as a full-time seminary teacher in Salt Lake Valley.
Was he an apostle by that point or not yet? That's putting you on the spot because maybe you wouldn't remember.
He was not an apostle.
Okay.
He was an assistant to the 12. And so he was asked to talk one evening to all the seminary faculty in the valley. Now, I was always proud that I had an association with Boyd Packer because my mother and his older sister were very close friends, Opal Packer. And so I felt very close to Boyd Packer. And Boyd Packer had, at that particular time, he had talked to Lyndon B. Johnson personally about allowing Mormons to become chaplains, and that became a famous story. So in a Q&A with Boyd Packer there that evening, I raised my hand and I said, "Can you tell us about your experience with President Lyndon B. Johnson?" And he was kind of quippy. He didn't go into the story. It was like, I was intruding in on what was really important, and that was blocking and tackling for CES faculty, seminary, and institute teachers in the Salt Lake Valley. So I thought, what went wrong there? So I went up to him afterwards, and I said, "I'm Roger Hendrix. I'm Vera Levon Nelson's son, Opal Packer's good close friend. She spent a lot of time in your home." He said, "Oh yes, I remember Vera. So you're Vera's son." And then he started looking around at my hair, and he said, "Well, kind of long, isn't it?" And then I had a wide tie on, which was kind of stylish there. He says, "Kind of wide tie, don't you think?" So I thought, well, that was it, And so I kind of felt, put down or put in place by him. And by that time, a little bit afterwards, at the death of President McKay, and then Joseph Fielding Smith becomes the president, and Boyd Packer becomes one of the 12. And so Boyd Packer started giving these classic talks that, kind of made my head swim. I thought they were odd talks sometimes. Some of them were brilliant, and some of them were odd, like, don't go too close to these mud holes because alligators are there, and he would give that. And so I always asked, well, what are the mud holes? Well, the mud holes are everything except the CES curriculum, going to church, being obedient. And then his classic talk on on the little machines that boys
Little
have.
factories, yeah.
Little factories. Whoa, that blew my mind. And then
Would masturbation have been a issue in the 60s and 70s that you would have been worrying about or thinking about or would have been tormented about?
no, I was never asked about masturbation. And the word masturbation, I'm not so sure the word masturbation was in my vocabulary. Other words were in my vocabulary about that, but that wasn't a big deal. I was never asked about that. I was never asked about that on the mission. That's an issue of recent vintage and worthy of discussion. Because I was a mission president during a period of time when evidently that was becoming a big issue. Back to Boyd Packer. So I'm off being a mission president. I'm off. I'm invited into the cafeteria where the general authorities eat lunch. And then Boyd Packer comes up to me. He's eating lunch with some of the other general authorities. And after lunch, he comes up to me, and his crowd comes with me. And I'd had his grandson in the mission, and he was nice. And the guys around him liked him. And he was kind of funny. And not funny, he was relaxed and joking. And so, how'd my grandson do? Your grandson is great. I loved your grandson. And I said, well, I have the wrong idea about him. The first time he's telling me my hair's too long, and that's 20 or 30 years earlier. And now we're talking like we're long-lost buddies. We're talking about his grandson. We're talking about the mission experience. And if ever there was a time to talk about my clothing, I didn't know I was going to go into that cafeteria. So I had a loud colored shirt on, and I had a very casual sports coat with Levi's, penny loafers on. And because they pulled me in at the last moment and I was out shopping or something. And so there I am. And I think I was wearing socks, but I can't really, testify to the truth of that. But, and so he was thoughtful. If ever he could have made comments about my clothes, then was the time. But he was interested in his grandson. He was interested in me. And so I went away having had the one experience with him, then having the other experience. And there's nothing like face-to-face experience. I kind of like the guy. But by that time, he was the acting president of the Quorum of the 12, so you didn't want to mess around with him. You wanted to be polite, but he was relaxed.
Yeah.
And so that's my Boyd Packer experience.
Okay. What about Jeffrey Holland?
I first met Jeff when he became the director of the Mutual Young Adult Program. And the Young Adult Program and the Institute Program were starting to collide. And he had just received his doctorate at Yale, and he was back and he had taught at the U, and now they tapped him to come up there, and it was the Young Adult Program that he was the head of. And so he visited me as the head of the Young Adult Program. He visited my institute, and that was before we built the building. And so I let the students put any kind of pictures so we could shellac them over on the walls, because I knew this was a temporary setup. So we had, it was a really secular wall. And so Jeff looked at these photos, and they were photos of, they were photos of surfing, because that's the kids did what we did in Southern California, and he took it in. I drove him around, and I was driving a Maverick Ford, and a hole had formed in the passenger seat, and there was a spring up there, and so he got in there, and I said, I've got to put something down there, and he took off his coat and he says, I'll sit on my coat. I thought, this is wow, all right. He's only 28 maybe, and I was 4 years younger, and so I would have been 24, 25. He's probably 30 by this time. And then we kept running into each other. He then became the Dean of Religious Instruction at BYU. Then he became the Commissioner of Education. Then he became the President of BYU. And at that time, I would meet him on occasion, and I was blown away by him on occasion. First of all, he was brought so easily to tears, and they weren't fake tears; they were real tears. And I said to myself, "This is a guy who loves the church more than I do. This is a guy who's had an even better experience than I've had," and so I was impressed with that. Then, as I started going up the career ladder in CES, I was in meetings up in Salt Lake where he and Hal Eyring would speak to us, because they were the big men in CES, and we were the coordinators over the field programs. And I noticed that when he got up to speak, first of all, his knees were baggy, and number two, his pants on the top were lighter or bleached out from the rest of his suit. It was obvious. And so the guy who was my superior, I asked him about that. His name was Frank Day. I said, he has his upper pants are bleached. And he said, he cries all the time. And the tears just fall down on his pants. And he's always on his knees praying. And now this was a guy that, if you're around him, he was kind of like I was. He loved the church. He was having a good experience with it, but he really loved the church. And even Hal Eyring would say, when I first met Jeff, I thought he was hyper about trying to do everything what the brethren wanted. Well, that began to be the signal that we followed the brethren. And he followed the brethren. The brethren loved him. And when Howard W. Hunter became the president of the church, boom, and there was an opening in that quorum of the 12, he picked Jeff immediately. So I was like Jeff. And since then, I always, he would. Now, when he and I would come together, not that often, but when he was kind of checking me out, he would joke with me. So I would joke back with him. But he can joke with you, but you can only joke so far with him. And at a certain point, he kind of just, you don't go as far as you thought you could go in the back and forth with him. And so
So if you take him and Packer's data points, it sounds like to be an apostle means to kind of make sure you put people in their place at the right time.
That's interesting. A little bit, yeah. They're kind of schooling you. The Brother Packer didn't want me to wear wide ties, and he thought my hair was too long. And Jeff Holland, hey, buddy, I can joke with you. You can joke with me up to a certain point, but wait a minute, there's a distance here. And I think he was naturally that way. And he's a preacher. He's a true evangelist. And that's what gets people excited about him. He'll lead with his jaw, and sometimes he has to pull in that he's made a mistake. But that's my experience with Jeff Holland.
This is probably going back a little bit in time, but I'm I'm going through the list of all the general authorities that you've mentioned that you've had personal interaction with. So I'm going to list them and only talk about them if they kind of fit during your CES years. But you say you met President Hinckley. Was that during your CES years?
Yeah.
And Faust?
Yeah. Okay. Just during the CES years.
Yeah.
President Hinckley. We were changing the stake presidency in our stake in Long Beach East Stake. I was on the High Council. And so what you do is you come up with 3 names to present to the general authority, and at that time he was an apostle, who you think should be the new stake president. And so I'd never met Brother Hinckley, and so it was my time to go into the room to meet with him, to give my 3 names on who I thought would be a good stake president. And I did, and
That's kind of weird. We think about inspiration as just the Lord telling Hinckley who the next stake president is, but kind of like Tom Phillips' experience where he's asked to give names for candidates of second anointing. It sounds like for stake president, you just get a bunch of local influencers to submit names, and that some would say that's part of the inspiration process, but it sounds like there's just kind of a recommendation process that heavily influences who gets called.
Yeah. At least that was the 2 times I was on the High Council and the 1 time I was a bishop, that's how they did it.
Okay. So you give the names to Hinckley
And so after the process, we're just talking, and then he stands up, I stand up, he shakes my hand, and then he draws me into him and looks at me straight in the eyes. I had never had an experience like that. And I kind of pulled away and looked down. And at that moment, I knew that, this isn't how it's supposed to be done. I'm supposed to look him back in the ideas and let him pull me close, because he's discerning my spirit. And so I said, well, my spirit's still a little young here, and so that was my first experience with Brother Hinckley.
So he was trying to gaze into your soul to understand who you were, to see into the depths of your soul by pulling you close and staring you in the eye.
Yeah, and yes, I can't do better than that, and you'll find, or I have found out, that church leadership is involved in hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews, and after a while, there are trends that start, patterns of speech, common problems, common issues, and then there are times when you might have to choose a new assistant to the president or a new bishop or something like that. And you're now very trained in interviewing, and so it comes down to 2 people who might be the bishop. Well, what you want to do is you want to get close to the 2 people, and you kind of want to feel them out. How do they feel? That's how I would do it. What's my sense of them the closer I got to them? And so I don't think that is an uncommon practice. But it's not. It's unique in Mormonism, because in business, the criteria is much harsher and to the point. But that's how you do it there.
Any other President Monson? Any interactions with President Monson during your CES years?
No, in my Deseret Trust years, yes.
Okay, later on. Ezra Taft Benson, any interactions with him during your CES years?
Yeah. We started having CES in-service meetings at BYU, where CES guys from all over the country would come in for a week for in-service training, and the apostles would talk. And we'd have it in the big Diong Hall, is that what it was called? And so I was going in through one of the doors to get my seat, and I bumped into Brother Benson, who was coming in, but I really bumped into him. And I turned around, and before I could say, "Oh, sorry," he said, he shook my hand, And he says, great being with you. How's everything going? I thought, gosh, this is like a captain. This is like guys who are great captains of athletic teams. This is how they kind of bring their guys in, pat them on the butt. I'm the big guy and you're the little guy, but I'm going to make you big by making you feel like you're my buddy. And that's what I felt from Brother Benson. And now, during this time, this was before it was the tension between Hugh Brown and Ezra Taft Benson, and I was a Hubie Brown guy, and I was philosophically and politically attuned to Brother Brown and not to Brother Benson. But that one meeting where we bumped in, and he was gracious, I liked him. I thought that was a good characteristic. I felt good. I felt like I was part of the team.
I have to say, I've had 2 lunches with Elder Holland. I played tennis with him at BYU when I was dating his daughter. So I've had at least 3 or 4 direct interactions with Elder Holland. And I remember him telling me and my brother, I wish there were 100,000 Joel and John Dallins in this church. And he would kind of slap you on the back. And they're very much in person about making you feel like $1 million.
Yeah, and in this case, when he says, I wish there were 1 million Joel and John Dallins, he was certainly right on that one with me.
I don't know about that. Talk about your John Carmack experience.
John Carmack, I was the director of the Institute of Religion at the University of Southern California, and he was the stake president of the Los Angeles stake. And Rodney Brady was one of his counselors. This was a heavyweight stake presidency. And they were very involved in the Institutes of Religion because you also had the wards in the same buildings, the student wards and the institutes in the same buildings. So they were always supporting us and encouraging us as institute directors. And I started trying to do interesting things there at USC. I started a last lecture series. If this, and inviting heavyweights in and serving dinner and having all the Mormon students at USC and surrounding areas too, because there were a lot of smaller colleges, having them come in, have dinner, have a big heavyweight speaker on, if this was your last lecture before you left this earth, what would you say? And so there was this one speaker who was a physicist. His name was Donald Spencer, and he worked with hydrogen lasers, and he has a hydrogen laser named after him. So this is a big heavyweight guy. And so Russian scientists were visiting him, and and this was during the Cold War days, and so I asked Don, would he give the last lecture, and he said, yeah, and he says, but I have my Russian scientist friends with me. Is it okay if I bring them? I say, yes, that would be cool. And he said, I only ask you one thing, let's not just start criticizing them because they're communists and because they're Russians and we'll beat the hell out of you guys. I said, not me, to bring them, more kids will come. And so John Carmack, who is the stake president, as I said, I invited him. He says, yeah, the whole stake presidency will come. We'll come with our wives. We packed the place. And I said to President Carmack, now, he's Donald Spencer, this great physicist who has developed the hydrogen laser, is bringing some Russian scientists with him who are coming in from Russia. And the only thing he asks is that we don't bombard or criticize these folks. Let's make them feel welcome. And President Carmack said, more than ever, this is so great. And so we got done with dinner, and we're all in the chapel, and so I asked Brother Carmack to say a couple words because he's the leading ecclesiastical leader in in the area. So he gets up there and he starts talking about America will defeat socialism in Russia. And I thought, he can't help himself. This was a sign of the times, especially with that generation. He was 20 years older than I was, especially with that generation after World War II and the Iron Curtain. And so it's just a reflexive move to have Russians in our congregation, and scientists to boot. He just couldn't help himself. And so after he said that, I said, President Carmack, I thought we weren't going to bomb these guys. And he says, well, how did I bomb these guys? And then again, they don't know that they don't know. That was my experience with Brother Carmack. Other than that, he was a leading lawyer in the community in West LA. Good guy. Am I taking too long, John?
No, this is great. I think people are going to enjoy some of these general authority stories, and so I think it's worth telling. We're coming close to the end of this episode. You mentioned in your notes having some discussions with a few general authorities around the homosexuality, LGBT kind of issues. You mentioned, I think, Elder Scott, and also, is it Hilbig?
Keith Hilbig.
Yeah. So what types of conversations would have been happening in the 60s and 70s around homosexuality, and what insight would the general authorities have given you back then?
Rich Scott was my mission president.
Richard G. Scott.
Yeah.
An apostle. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And he was a very sensitive guy. He was a left-hander. He was a nuclear physicist, helped develop the nuclear Nautilus submarine with Hyman Rickover. And his wife was the daughter of Arthur Watkins, the senator from Utah. So he was my mission president, and that's when I was the zone leader, when the zones were ginormous. And what I liked to do was I got a junior companion fresh out of the States, and I would hook him up with a local companion. I'd go out with a local companion. And one night I came in, and it was about 11 o'clock, and I turned on the lights, and my junior companion was up on the top bunk with his local companion, and the local companion only had his underwear on, and my companion had his garments on. And so I kind of freaked out,
They were making out?
I think they were sleeping. They were sleeping next to each other, and I don't think they were making out.
Okay.
But they were on the top bunk line next to each other. And so I turned on the light, and I said, get down, get dressed, get out. And so my junior companion, a very thoughtful guy, and he told President Scott that I had really, I'd really whacked the two of them. And he says, what's wrong with us being on the top bunk together? Or he didn't say that, but he shared it with Rich Scott because he was so upset that I had pounded on him on that. And so President Scott called me in, and he said, now, Roger, or Elder Hendrix, I don't know that you should be so hard on your companion. And, that could be just friendship. And so I just, that was a big lesson. Don't be so quick to judge, but even if you see something that you feel is compromising, don't get upset. Don't become so intense. Get facts before you judge, type of thing. And he was very thoughtful. And then with President Hilbig, he was.
Is that possible that Scott was more progressive or more tolerant on LGBT issues then? Is that possible?
Well,
Than say a Packer who was doing the pamphlet that basically said punch somebody if they ever like punched a missionary, if they ever proposition you, in a gay way. Is there a chance that Scott was more progressive on that issue?
yeah, no two individuals occupy the same spot, and so if I never read that pamphlet, but if Elder Packer said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that Elder Scott means that, and I got the feeling didn't mean that. He was a thoughtful guy, and he was thoughtful like an artist is thoughtful.
He is an artist.
He is an artist, yeah. And I have 2 of his paintings in my home, and so I think that contributes to who he is. I don't think Rich Scott is fast to judge.
I'm pretty sure he had a gay son.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that he did.
Okay. And so now I took that as a positive lesson because of my intensity, because of my out frontness. Hey, you be slow to judge. Don't flip on the lights and command, get your clothes on, get out. And so that was, I thought President Scott was right.
Okay. Hilbig.
President Hilbig, I served in the stake presidency with him as he was the stake president. It's the Palos Verdes stake. And as early as 1980, he and I were discussing whether or not being gay was a genetic predisposition. And we would discuss it back and forth, and finally I said, I think it's a genetic predisposition. I don't think people choose to be gay. I think they are gay. Now that caused a little bit of a stir when some of my fellow priesthood leaders who are bishops and that type of thing found out about that, that I thought it was genetic. And so they came out and told President Hilbig they thought that I was wrong, and why do you have a council like that? But Keith Hilbig never criticized me, never took an opposite position to mine, and in fact said that it looks that way. And so, there, when you give someone enough time to think about it now, I think they were coming around, or they were thinking about it. Is it a choice or is it genetic? And there are still people who believe that, you just choose to be that way. That's your lifestyle, and you make excuses. And then there are those of us that, that's crazy. And Armin Moss also helped me on that later on. I was just going by my gut. It just seems to me that this is genetic. And Armin Moss and I would get together with his brother and have dinner. And Armin said, in the Journal of Social Statistics, which has been kept since 1902, the evidence is overwhelming that 2 to 5% of the population they're always gay, and so it's not something they choose. They come that way. They are that way, and so I told Keith, I thought it was genetic. I think we shouldn't get so upset. We shouldn't be so rough on this. And remember, I had learned from President Scott to be slow to judge. And so he said, it kind of looks that way.
You mentioned that in interaction with Elder Eyring, became an impetus for you to leave CES. So if there's any other general authority stories you want to tell during your CES years, you can, but let's end with the one with Elder Eyring, Henry Eyring, and why that was an impetus for you leaving CES.
Yeah. Are you surprised that I'm such a big storyteller?
No, because we've hung out a little bit.
Okay.
And I think this is Mormon Stories.
Okay.
And
That's it.
I think we love general authorities in this church. And there's going to be very few people I ever interview who have interacted with so many general authorities. And so I think people are going to eat this up. That's my prediction. I could be wrong.
Okay. Hal Eyring. So Hal Eyring was a professor of business at Stanford University, then became the president of Ricks College, and then became the associate commissioner for seminaries and institutes, which then put him down in Southern California talking with the CES faculty. And that's while I was in my last year being the institute director at USC. And so we all gathered in the chapel with our polyester suits and big wing-tipped shoes, and here walks Hal Eyring. He is bald, but it's a slick bald, and his glasses are professorial glasses, and then his tie is just spiffy. It's a striped spiffy, blue, red and blue striped, red and black, red and navy blue striped, and his coat was a wool coat, not a polyester coat, and it fit his body. And then I looked down at his shoes, and he didn't have these big fat wingtip shoes that we wore. He had these skinny wingtip shoes, and this, I thought, this guy is not like us. You know, where's this guy been all my life? And then he got up and he took his coat off. Oh my gosh. He actually took his coat off to talk to us, and he got a chalkboard or a grease board up there on the podium of the chapel, and he started taking questions and answers from us, and he answered it like a businessman would answer it. And when somebody would ask him a question that he didn't know, he said, I need to think about that, and he put a little note in the corner to remind him to come back to that question. And as he talked like that, I had the idea, I would love to be like that. But I passed it off. I'm a CES guy. But he is one cool associate commissioner of seminaries and institutes.
He's a Harvard dude.
He is that
Stanford
and more.
guy, yeah.
And I thought, how do people get to be like that? I mean, he's amazing. I loved him, and I loved how he talked, and I loved how, if I don't know, I'm going to put a little note to myself up there. It's okay if I don't know. Let me think about it. And then he answered questions with business diagrams, and I loved it. And about 3 years later, becoming an administrator, and then getting a chance with my buddies to go on the radio. Here's my chance. And I just took it. Now, I had 5 kids. What a jerk I was to even think about that. But my wife went along with it, and we made it work. And my prototype, that figure that I really liked, was that of Hal Eyring. I understood him. He was flexible, and he was cerebral.
What was the bad experience, though, that made you want to leave CES?
There was no bad experience except that I became an administrator, and it was like
You wrote he expected me to greet him first.
Okay. So now you said just the CES experiences. Beyond CES, when I would meet him, like I would be a speaker and he'd be a speaker, and we'd show up, and he became then the commissioner, and then he he became the presiding bishopric, etc. I'm used to these guys coming up to you, and for some reason I wouldn't come up to him, and that bugged him. And he expected me to come up to him and approach him, and I expected him to come up to me. And so it never kind of worked from that point on. And really the end point of that was when he was in the presiding bishopric, and we were invited. I was invited with my daughter to sit on the front row in the tabernacle, and he was sitting right in front of us with the presiding bishopric. And I was just sitting there. He was there. I don't want to bother these guys. And he would wave at me, and I wouldn't wave back. I thought he was waving at somebody else, And finally, he called me over there, and forced the conversation. But that was it. Now these are just little sketches of personal interactions, who says what to whom first. And, I usually got it right, but sometimes I got it wrong. And so I didn't. And, we didn't become bosom buddies. I still like it when, I still like the way he dresses. I still kind of like his aura.
All right. Well, it's been really, really fun to hear a bunch of general authority stories by Dr. Roger Hendrix, to hear his experiences in CES from the early 70s through the early 80s. And so we want to thank you for joining us in part 2 of this episode and invite you to stick around. Next, we're going to talk about his ascendancy to mission president status, what it was like to be a mission president. I guess other than Ted Lyon, Dr. Ted Lyon, I'm not sure if we've ever had a mission president on Mormon Stories, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about his brush with potentially becoming an area authority, which might have led to being a general authority, and we're going to talk about his time working on the board of Deseret Trust Company, which manages billions of dollars of assets for the church. That's all important stuff. He was called to that by President Hinckley. And we're going to end talking about his reflections on the modern church, his own faith journey. And so we've got a lot of cool things ahead. So thanks for joining us for part 2 of this episode. And don't go away. Join us again immediately for part 3 of our interview with Roger Hendrix. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.